Tonight on Upload Records Music News, we're stepping into one of the biggest debates in music technology history: analog versus digital, vintage soul versus modern precision. And honestly, this one gets emotional for a lot of Journey fans. Because for decades, people have treated the legendary Roland Jupiter-8 like it was sacred, untouchable, the gold standard of arena rock synthesizers, the machine behind those soaring textures, those cinematic intros, those huge emotional layers that helped define the sound of Journey in the 80s. But now, the 2026 Final Frontier Tour has entered the conversation with something completely different: modern digital workstations, advanced modeling engines, touring hardware designed to recreate every harmonic imperfection of analog gear without the instability, the maintenance nightmares, or the unpredictability that came with vintage synths. And tonight, we are putting them head to head. Can modern digital technology finally capture the soul of analog? Or is there still something hiding inside those drifting oscillators from the 1980s that machines simply can't reproduce? We're about to find out. So close your eyes for a second. Imagine hearing that soaring lead line from Separate Ways, that massive synth tone rising underneath the guitars, filling an arena with emotion. You hear warmth, movement, texture, something human. But here's the challenge. Can you actually tell whether you're hearing the original 1980s Roland Jupiter-8 or a brand new 2026 Final Frontier digital workstation? Seriously. Because 40 years ago, analog synthesizers weren't trying to be perfect. In fact, the imperfections became the magic. Those old oscillators drifted slightly out of tune. Voltage fluctuations created tiny inconsistencies. Filters behaved unpredictably. Every note breathed a little differently. And somehow, those flaws created emotion. That emotional instability became the sound of arena rock. When Journey filled stadiums in the 80s, those synth textures weren't sterile. They moved like waves. They floated behind the vocals. They wrapped around Neil Sean's guitars like atmospheric smoke. And fans connected to that, not because the sound was technically perfect, but because it felt alive. Now fast forward to 2026. Modern workstations have become unbelievably powerful. These systems analyze analog circuitry component by component. They model saturation curves, oscillator instability, harmonic distortion, filter behavior, even the microscopic timing inconsistencies that used to happen naturally in old hardware. In other words, digital synths are no longer trying to sound clean. They're trying to sound human, and that changes everything. So tonight, we decided to conduct a blind comparison challenge. No labels, no vintage bias, no nostalgia goggles, just pure listening. We recreated classic Journey-style synth patches using the original vintage Roland Jupiter-8, and then recreated those same tones using the latest 2026 Final Frontier touring workstation. Same melody, same processing, same performance style. And honestly, the results were shocking. At first, the Jupiter-8 immediately hits you with this organic instability. The chords shimmer unpredictably. The top end feels slightly rough around the edges. There's this drifting motion underneath sustained notes that almost sounds emotional by itself. You don't hear technology. You hear atmosphere. You hear motion. You hear tension. That's the magic analog fans talk about. But then, the 2026 workstation enters the comparison. And suddenly, things get complicated. Because modern modeling has gotten terrifyingly accurate. The drift is there. The saturation is there. Even the subtle harmonic bloom when chords expand across stereo space, it's there too. But something else happens. The modern workstation stays focused. The low end remains tighter. The stereo imaging feels wider. The synth cuts through a live mix more effectively than the original analog hardware ever could. And that's where the argument begins. Because analog purists will immediately say, yeah, but digital still doesn't have soul. But what exactly is soul in a synthesizer? Is it imperfection, instability, noise, or is it emotional impact? Because if a modern workstation makes listeners feel the same emotional lift during a Journey chorus, does it matter how the sound was created? That's the uncomfortable question. And honestly, I think the answer is changing in 2026. Let's talk about the analog benchmark for a second, because this is where things get fascinating. The original Roland Jupiter-8 wasn't designed to become a mythical arena rock machine. Back in the early 80s, it was simply one of the most advanced polyphonic synthesizers ever built. But musicians discovered something unique inside it. Its oscillators drifted in a way that created width without needing digital effects. Its filters introduced harmonic distortion that thickened melodies naturally. And when players stacked chords together, the slight tuning inconsistencies created emotional tension that modern digital gear struggled to recreate for decades. That drift became iconic, especially during power ballads. Listen closely to those giant emotional synth beds underneath classic arena rock choruses, and you'll notice they never sit perfectly still. They float. They breathe. They almost ache emotionally. That movement became part of the Journey identity. Now compare that to today's 2026 Final Frontier hardware. The interface looks almost clinical by comparison. Bright displays, touchscreens, preset management systems, total recall functionality, massive DSP processing power. At first glance, it feels cold, too perfect, too calculated. But then you hear what these machines are actually doing. Modern modeling engines now simulate oscillator drift independently for every voice. They recreate analog saturation curves dynamically depending on note velocity. Some systems even emulate power supply instability from vintage circuitry. Think about that for a second. Engineers are now digitally recreating electrical imperfections on purpose because those imperfections became emotionally valuable. That's how far this technology has evolved. And during our side-by-side comparisons, certain moments became almost impossible to distinguish, especially inside a full mix. Soloed tracks still revealed differences. The original analog synth had a slightly rougher upper mid-range character. The vintage filter sweeps carried a grainy unpredictability that sounded beautifully unstable. But in a stadium environment, with guitars, vocals, drums, crowd noise, reverbs, and live acoustics surrounding everything, the gap became incredibly small. Much smaller than analog purists probably want to admit. And here's where the conversation gets really controversial. There were moments where the 2026 workstation actually sounded better. Yeah, I said it. Because while the vintage Jupiter-8 sounded magical in isolation, it also became muddy at times. Certain frequencies clashed inside dense arrangements. Oscillator drift occasionally weakened the clarity of big chord stacks. The modern workstation solved those problems while preserving most of the emotional texture. That's a huge deal, especially for live touring. Because Journey's modern arena productions demand consistency every single night. Vintage analog hardware can sound incredible, but it can also behave unpredictably under changing temperatures, voltage conditions, and touring stress. Modern systems deliver nearly identical emotional character, while remaining stable enough for massive global productions. And that reality matters. Now, does that mean the analog myth is officially dead? Not exactly, because there's still something psychologically powerful about vintage hardware. Musicians perform differently around it. There's a tactile unpredictability that inspires creativity. When you play an original analog synth, you're interacting with physical circuitry behaving in real time. Tiny changes happen constantly. No two performances feel identical. That relationship affects the musician emotionally, and emotion changes performance. So maybe the real soul wasn't only in the oscillators after all. Maybe part of it was always in the human response to the machine. But from a pure sonic perspective, the divide is closing fast, painfully fast, to the point where blind listening tests are becoming genuinely difficult. And honestly, that might upset some people. Because entire collector markets were built around the belief that vintage analog warmth could never truly be recreated. Yet here we are, in 2026, listening to digital systems reproduce those legendary Journey textures with frightening accuracy. Not just the notes, not just the tone, but the emotional resonance itself. That soaring cinematic atmosphere, that drifting melancholy, that huge arena rock lift that makes fans feel like they're floating during a chorus. Modern technology is finally capturing it, and maybe, just maybe, surpassing it in practical performance. So, what's the final sonic verdict? Did the 2026 Final Frontier workstations successfully capture the soul required for Journey's legacy? I think the answer is yes, but not because they perfectly copied the past. Instead, they understood what mattered emotionally about the past. That's the difference. The goal was never to clone old circuitry exactly. The goal was to recreate how those sounds made people feel. And for the first time, modern digital synthesis genuinely feels emotionally competitive with vintage analog gear. That doesn't erase the magic of the original Roland Jupiter-8. It doesn't erase history. It doesn't erase nostalgia. But it does signal something important about the future of synthesis. The analog versus digital war may finally be ending, not because one side destroyed the other, but because technology finally learned how to preserve emotion. And honestly, that might be the most journey thing imaginable. A bridge between eras, vintage soul meeting futuristic precision, human emotion carried forward through evolving technology. Now the real question is for you. If you closed your eyes during that final comparison, could you actually tell which synth was analog and which one was digital? Or has the sonic divide officially disappeared? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Upload Records Music News for more deep dives into classic rock, vintage gear, and the future of music technology.